Shireen, you began this conversation with a very ominous figure on the wall, which is 151 years needed to bring about parity and economic participation by women. How do you arrive at that number? Which level of economic participation or empowerment do you measure to reach that number? Let me give you an Indian context. We are a billion-plus society, of which 1.35 billion is the population, of which 1.3 billion Indians now have a digital identity, men and women equally so. We are a 700 million literate people, of which 600 million are in the workforce, men and women included. Some in the organized sector, some in the unorganized sector. When you talk about fiscal services, we need to see what did India do pre-pandemic, because not much can be spoken of post-pandemic or as we transition out of pandemic from a gender perspective justly without recognizing what happened before the pandemic. Now, in the year 2014, the Prime Minister said that in a billion-plus society, we have close to 400 million people who are unbanked, out of which 220 million were women. The banks reached out for the first time in India. No individual walked up to a bank branch. Banking correspondents reached out to our society at large at zero deposits, opened up bank accounts for 440 million Indians, of which 220 million were women. Now, you speak about Mudra Yojana. It was not a gendered fiscal service. Mudra Yojana was basically a financial service where up to ₹1 million for small industry, cottage industry, that credit support without collateral was proposed by the government. There was no subscription that this would be the agency of only women. Yeah. What surprised people in the fiscal world was that 70% of the 320 million loans given out were taken by women, which means many recognize that at the entry level of enterprise, you have a female talent, which by that time was appearing to be unrecognized. Then we came to a stage where we said, if we want to provide support fiscally for mid-sized companies, the startup regime, should we do this again, not a gendered financial service, but Stand Up India came about. Nobody expected that 80% of the beneficiaries will turn out to be women, which means that in a world which is talking about, especially in Davos, where we speak about skilling, reskilling, this was a latent talent which was unrecognized. Women had the skill sets to draw up a business plan, go to a bank, convince the banking sector of their business potential. And as ministers rightly said, even in India, the NPA is 1% or less, which means when you support the agency of women, what do you support? It makes fiscal sense, yep. It is societally empowering, and it is civilizationally beneficial. Again, I'll go back to the number that you have pronounced here. How does India feature in that gap index? Which part of Indian womanhood is not recognized in that index? You speak about political power. I have 1.4 million women who get elected to office in the grassroots structure of governance, which is our panchayat. These are women who spend money from the Indian treasury on issues which impact not only women's issues, but also society at large, looking at infrastructure, the grassroots, health, education. They don't get recognized in that index. It's as though they don't exist. I have 15 million women today in India who sit in administrative governance positions who don't get recognized by the index. Do they not exist? They very well do. I have 80 million women in India who handle singularly close to $32 billion worth of credit for themselves as a coalition. They skill themselves digitally and physically on many issues. They are a part of a supply chain of craft, of agro-processing. They don't figure there because they are not large industrial houses to sit at tables such as this and say, we matter. We keep the economic wheels turning. So when you put money behind the agency of women, is it only enough to do so fiscally? What are the human development issues on which, if you put that money on infrastructure, particularly supporting women, that it'll have a GDP impact? So again, I turn the clock back to 2014 when the Prime Minister said from the ramparts of the Red Fort, if we speak of gender justice, can we start by building toilets for women? Now, no man in my country, and I'm sure I can speak for many democracies across the world, would ever stand on Independence Day and say, let's build toilets for women. It's not politically glamorous, but my Prime Minister did. We built 110 million individual household toilets for women. Now, if you look at the fiscal impact, in 2013, the World Bank report said that due to the lack of sanitation facilities, there is a negative 6% impact on our GDP. So while this looked like a pronounced intervention for women's health and sanitation, it had an impact on the economy as a whole. So I think that if we are looking at the cause of women to be served, we need to recognize, and we have set an example in India, that it cannot be siloed, only fiscal, only academic, only skill. It has to be a holistic enterprise. Governance, policymakers, private sector, all have to come together. It is not a path of revolution that can be walked singularly.